All stories posted on our channel are stories from our subscribers and created by us based on real events we've experienced and witnessed. We post new stories every day for your entertainment, that we hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
The rain hammered against the windows of our colonial house in Westchester County, creating a rhythmic percussion that usually soothed me after long days at the architectural firm. That particular Thursday evening in late October, however, nothing could provide comfort. I sat in my leather chair in the study, a glass of 18-year-old scotch untouched on the side table, staring at a spreadsheet on my laptop that made absolutely no sense to me. Despite having graduated summa cum laude from Cornell with a degree in architecture and a minor in business, my name is Marcus Whitfield. I was 42 years old, a senior partner at Brennan & Associates, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in Manhattan. I had spent nearly 2 decades building my career, brick by metaphorical brick, designing skyscrapers and residential complexes that now dotted the New York skyline. I drove a Mercedes, owned a boat I rarely used, and had a retirement account that would have made my late father, a mechanic from rural Pennsylvania, weep with disbelief. By every conceivable metric of American success, I had made it. And yet here I sat, trying to comprehend how my mother-in-law, Dolores Fairbanks, had accumulated $400,000 in debt without anyone noticing. The door to my study creaked open, and my wife of 15 years, Vivian, stepped inside. She was still beautiful at 40, the same auburn hair that had captivated me during our chance meeting at a gallery opening in Soho, the same green eyes that had promised me a lifetime of partnership. But there was something different about her posture that evening. She carried herself with the rigid determination of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "We need to talk about my mother's situation," she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. I gestured toward the laptop screen. "I've been looking at the numbers, Viv. I don't understand how this happened. Credit cards, personal loans, a second mortgage on her condo in Boca Raton. She's been living like a woman with 3 times her income." Vivian crossed her arms, remaining standing, a negotiating posture I recognized from her years as a pharmaceutical sales representative before she decided to become a full-time charity board member and tennis enthusiast. How it happened isn't really the point anymore, Marcus. The point is that it needs to be fixed. I agree it needs to be addressed. We can help her find a financial advisor, maybe negotiate with the creditors for a settlement. No, the word fell like a gavel. I've already spoken with my brother Gregory, and we've discussed this extensively. The family needs to handle this quietly, without involving outsiders who might complicate things or, God forbid, allow word to get out among our social circles. I took a slow breath, reaching for the scotch I had been ignoring. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, buying me a moment to choose my words carefully. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Gregory will contribute $50,000. It's all he can manage with the twins in private school and the renovation of their house in Greenwich. The rest—" She paused, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, a hardening, a calcification of whatever tenderness had once existed there. "The rest will need to come from us." The math was simple enough. 400,000 minus 50,000 left $350,000. Our savings account held roughly 60,000. Our investment portfolio, not including retirement accounts that would incur massive penalties if touched early, sat at around 200,000. Even liquidating everything we had accumulated over 15 years of marriage would leave us $90,000 short. And that was assuming we wanted to gut our entire financial security for her mother's irresponsibility. "Vivian, you're talking about destroying our financial future. The college fund for Jake and Lily, our emergency reserves, everything. My mother's dignity is worth more than money in a savings account." "Her dignity?" I couldn't help the incredulous laugh that escaped my throat. "Her dignity is what got us into this situation. The designer clothes, the first-class flights to Europe, the constant need to appear wealthier than she actually is. That's not dignity. That's vanity. Vivian's face flushed with anger, but she maintained her composure with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her entire life navigating the treacherous waters of upper-middle-class respectability. I won't stand here and let you insult my mother, Marcus. She raised me and Gregory on her own after my father passed. She sacrificed everything for us. And now you want me to sacrifice everything for her, our children's future. Jake and Lily will be fine. You make excellent money. You'll rebuild the savings in a few years. I stared at my wife, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in years, perhaps ever. The entitlement in her voice wasn't new, but it had never been directed at me with such naked force. Vivian had grown up in an environment where money was a tool to be used, a river that flowed endlessly from mysterious sources that were never questioned or examined too closely. Her father, before his heart attack when she was 16, had been a successful insurance executive who left the family comfortable but not wealthy. Dolores had spent the subsequent 24 years pretending otherwise. "What about your mother selling the condo?" I suggested. "It must be worth at least $300,000 in today's market. And where would she live? With us?" Vivian's tone made it clear this was not a genuine offer. She could downsize, rent an apartment, use the proceeds to pay off her debts like any responsible adult would. My mother is 71 years old. She's not going to start over in some cramped apartment like a common. She stopped herself, but I heard the unspoken word hanging in the air between us. Like a common what, Vivian? Like someone who lives within their means. Like the people I grew up with in Scranton, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. Don't bring your childhood into this. You've spent the last 20 years trying to escape where you came from, so don't pretend you have some noble connection to working-class values now. The words struck deeper than she probably intended, or perhaps exactly as deep as she intended. I had spent my adult life building something, proving that the son of a mechanic and a school lunch lady could sit at the same table as the Fairbanks family and their ilk. I'd endured subtle condescension at holiday dinners, thinly veiled jokes about my rustic origins, and the constant implication that Vivian had married beneath her station. I had endured it all because I loved her, because I believed we were building something together that transcended the arbitrary lines of class and background. Now I understood the truth. I had never really been accepted. I was simply useful, a reliable income stream that could be tapped when the family's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "I need to think about this," I said finally, my voice flat and controlled. "This isn't a decision that gets made in one conversation. There's nothing to think about, Marcus. This is my mother. This is family. You're either with us or you're not." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy as the rain that continued to assault the windows. I met my wife's gaze and saw no room for negotiation, no acknowledgement that there might be legitimate concerns with her demands. In her mind, the matter was already settled. The only question was whether I would comply gracefully or need to be dragged into compliance through whatever pressure she deemed necessary. "I'll give you my answer by the end of the week," I said. Vivian nodded curtly, as if granting me permission to consider the matter she had already decided. "Friday. We'll discuss it over dinner." She turned and left the study, closing the door behind her with the same deliberate care she had used to open it. I sat in silence for a long time after she left, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of my children, 14-year-old Jake practicing guitar in his room, 12-year-old Lily talking on the phone with her friends, my children who would be devastated if their family imploded, my children who deserved better than to become pawns in a financial chess game they didn't understand. I finished the scotch and poured another. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a door had opened. A door I hadn't known existed until that moment. Through it, I could see a different path, a road that led away from everything I had built and towards something unknown but undeniably free. I didn't make any decisions that night. I simply sat with the knowledge that decisions would need to be made and that none of them would be easy. The weekend passed in a strange twilight of normalcy. Vivian and I moved through our routines with the practiced choreography of longtime spouses, breakfast conversations about schedules, coordinated transportation for the kids' activities, shared dinners where we discussed everything except the elephant that had taken up residence in our living room. To an outside observer, we might have appeared to be any other affluent family navigating the ordinary challenges of suburban existence. On Saturday morning, I took Jake to his guitar lesson at a small studio in White Plains. My son had inherited my dark hair, but his mother's elegant features, and at 14 he was beginning to show signs of the man he would become. Thoughtful, somewhat introverted, possessed of a dry humor that occasionally caught me off guard. As we drove through the rain-slicked streets, he surprised me by turning down the radio and asking a direct question. "Dad, is something wrong between you and Mom?" I kept my eyes on the road, buying time. "What makes you ask that? You guys have been weird since Thursday, like too polite, you know? It's the same way you act around Grandma Dolores when she's being annoying, but you don't want to start a fight." The observation was more astute than I would have expected from a teenager more typically focused on his social media feeds and the intricacies of whatever video game currently held his attention. I felt a surge of pride at his perceptiveness, immediately followed by a wave of guilt that my children were already sensing the fault lines developing in their parents' marriage. "Mom and I have some things we're working through," I said carefully. "Adult stuff, nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about money? I heard you guys talking the other night. Something about Grandma owing people?" I pulled into the parking lot of the music studio and turned off the engine, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, droplets collecting on the windshield like countless tiny decisions waiting to be made. "Your grandmother made some mistakes with her finances," I explained. "Your mom thinks we should help fix those mistakes. It's complicated." Jake nodded slowly, processing the information with a maturity beyond his years. "But we have enough money, right? Like, we're not poor or anything." "No, we're not poor. The question is more about what's fair and what's responsible. Sometimes helping someone means giving them money. Sometimes it means helping them learn to handle their own problems. Your mom and I don't quite agree on which approach is right here." "Grandma Dolores always does have a lot of nice stuff," Jake observed. "Every time we visit her in Florida, she's got something new. Jewelry or furniture or whatever. Mom says it's because she deserves nice things after working hard her whole life." I bit back the response that rose in my throat, that Dolores Fairbanks hadn't actually worked in nearly 2 decades, having retired early from her position as a dental office manager and spent the subsequent years living off a combination of Social Security, her late husband's modest pension, and apparently an increasingly precarious tower of debt. "People have different ideas about what they deserve," I said instead. "Go on. You'll be late for your lesson. I'll pick you up at noon." After Jake disappeared into the studio, I sat in the car and began making phone calls. The first was to my personal attorney, Theodore Yates, a former classmate from Cornell who had built a successful practice in Manhattan, specializing in family law. I had never imagined I would need his services in any professional capacity, but life has a way of presenting circumstances we never anticipated. "Marcus," Theodore answered on the 3rd ring. "It's been a while. Don't tell me you're finally ready to draw up that will we discussed last year." "Not exactly. I need to ask some hypothetical questions about marital assets and financial obligations." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that comes when a professional recognizes that a conversation has just shifted from casual to serious. "I'm listening." I outlined the situation in broad terms. A spouse demanding payment of a parent's significant debt, the potential impact on shared assets, the legal implications of various responses. Theodore listened without interruption until I finished. "The good news, if you can call it that, is that you have no legal obligation to pay your mother-in-law's debts. They're her responsibility entirely. The more complicated question is, what happens if you refuse and your wife decides to pay anyway using marital assets? Can she do that? New York is an equitable distribution state, not community property. While assets are being divided in a divorce, The court looks at what's fair, not necessarily what's equal. If Vivian were to drain your joint accounts without your consent to pay off her mother's debt, that could be considered dissipation of marital assets. You'd have a strong argument for recoupment in any divorce settlement. The word divorce hung in the air, suddenly tangible and real in a way it hadn't been before. I had been thinking of this situation in terms of financial negotiations, strategies, possible compromises. Theodore's legal framework forced me to confront the possibility that my marriage might not survive, regardless of what decision I made about Dolores's debt. "What about the kids?" I asked. "If things went that direction, what would happen with custody? You're a stable, well-employed father with no history of abuse or neglect. In most cases, the court prefers joint custody arrangements that maintain relationships with both parents. Unless there are aggravating factors, you'd likely be looking at shared custody with a schedule that accounts for work obligations and the children's needs." I thanked Theodore and promised to keep him informed. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching families come and go from the various businesses in the strip mall. The music studio, a tutoring center, a dance academy. Normal families leading normal lives, or at least maintaining the appearance of normality. I wondered how many of them harbored secrets similar to mine, how many of them were one conversation away from having their carefully constructed worlds collapse. That afternoon, while Vivian was at her tennis lesson and Lily was at a friend's house, I began what I thought of as an archaeological excavation of my marriage. I retreated to my study and started reviewing financial documents, bank statements, credit card records, investment accounts. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply trying to understand the full landscape of my financial life before making any decisions about its future. What I found surprised me. Over the past 3 years, Vivian had been withdrawing increasingly large sums from our joint savings account. The transactions were disguised as household expenses, but the amounts didn't match any patterns of household spending I could identify. 3,000 here, 5,000 there, amounts small enough not to trigger immediate alarm, but significant enough to add up over time. In total, I calculated that roughly $45,000 had disappeared into this financial black hole. A deeper examination of our credit card statements revealed a parallel pattern. Vivian maintained a personal card that I paid off each month without examining closely, a matter of trust, or perhaps simply the complacency that develops after 15 years of marriage. The charges told a story I hadn't previously read. Regular transfers to a PayPal account I didn't recognize, repeated purchases from high-end stores that I had never seen appear in our home, hotel charges for establishments in Manhattan on days when Vivian had claimed to be at charity functions or board meetings. The implications assembled themselves slowly in my mind, each piece clicking into place with the mechanical precision of a lock being picked. Vivian hadn't been caught off guard by her mother's financial crisis. She had likely known about it for years and had been quietly diverting our family's resources to prop up Dolores's lifestyle while maintaining the appearance that everything was normal. The demand for $350,000 wasn't a sudden emergency. It was the culmination of a long-running deception that had finally grown too large to hide. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling something shift inside me. The anger I expected didn't come. Not yet. Instead, there was a strange clarity, the kind that comes when you finally understand a situation that has puzzled you for years. Every time I had questioned an expense and received a dismissive explanation. Every time Vivian had insisted we couldn't afford a vacation I had suggested, only to discover that her mother had just returned from another trip to Europe. Every subtle criticism of my paranoid attention to our household budget, all of it made sense now. I had been a mark, a reliable source of income to be managed and manipulated rather than a partner to be consulted and respected. The realization didn't hurt as much as I would have expected. Perhaps the pain would come later. In that moment, there was only the cold satisfaction of finally seeing the truth. I spent the rest of the afternoon making copies of every financial document I could find. I opened a new email account under a name that couldn't be traced to me and began forwarding relevant files. I compiled a timeline of the suspicious transactions and created a narrative that any competent attorney or divorce court judge would be able to follow. When Vivian returned from tennis, flushed and cheerful from her exercise, I greeted her with the same practice smile I'd been using for years. We discussed dinner plans. We talked about Lily's upcoming school play. We existed together in the space of our beautiful home, two people who had become strangers without ever officially meeting. That night, lying in bed beside my wife, I made a decision. I would not pay $350,000 to rescue Dolores Fairbanks from the consequences of her own choices. I would not allow myself to be manipulated any further. But I also would not confront Vivian with what I had discovered. Not yet. First, I needed a plan. First, I needed to understand all my options. The door in my mind that had opened on Thursday night was now wide enough to walk through. I didn't know yet where it led, but I was increasingly certain that I would be finding out. The following week proceeded like a carefully choreographed performance in which I was both actor and director. Each morning I rose at my usual time, showered, dressed in my customary attire of tailored suits and Italian leather shoes, and descended to the kitchen where Vivian would be preparing breakfast for the children. We exchanged the kind of dialogue that married couples exchange when they have run out of things to say but haven't yet acknowledged the silence. Weather reports, schedule confirmations, mundane observations about neighborhood gossip. At the office, I moved through my responsibilities with mechanical precision. My current project was a 30-story residential tower in Midtown, a sleek glass and steel structure that would house wealthy New Yorkers in apartments starting at $2 million. The irony of designing homes for the ultra-rich while my own financial security crumbled was not lost on me, but I had grown skilled at compartmentalization over the years. Work was work. Home was something else entirely. During my lunch hours, I began making preparations. On Monday, I opened a personal checking account at a bank where Vivian and I had no existing relationship, using my office as the mailing address. On Tuesday, I met with Theodore Yates in person to discuss asset protection strategies. Not divorce proceedings, not yet, but the preliminary steps one takes when divorce becomes a possibility. On Wednesday, I retained a private investigator named Raymond Castellano, a former NYPD detective who came highly recommended for his discretion and thoroughness. "What exactly do you want me to find?" Raymond asked during our initial meeting, a lunch at a quiet restaurant in Tribeca where we were unlikely to encounter anyone I knew. "I want to understand my wife's financial activities for the past 5 years. Bank accounts I might not know about, unusual transactions, the source of approximately $45,000 that has disappeared from our accounts over the past 3 years. Raymond, a stocky man in his late 50s with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much human weakness, nodded without judgment. "And if I find something beyond financial irregularities, personal matters, let's say?" The question gave me pause. The hotel charges I had discovered on Vivian's credit card had suggested possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to fully consider. "I want the complete picture," I said finally, "whatever that includes." On Thursday, the day before my deadline to provide Vivian with an answer, I made a decision that surprised even me. I took the afternoon off work and drove to Scranton, Pennsylvania, a journey of about 2.5 hours through the grey November landscape of northern New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. My father had passed away 8 years earlier, and my mother had followed him 2 years later, but my younger sister Colleen still lived in the area with her husband Patrick and their 3 children. Colleen worked as a nurse at Geisinger Community Medical Center, a profession she had chosen because it allowed her to help people while still maintaining a life outside the hospital walls. She was 5 years younger than me, with the same dark hair and our father's practical intelligence. We had never been as close as I would have liked, Geography and lifestyle differences had created a distance that we navigated with biannual visits and occasional phone calls, but she was family in a way that Vivian's relatives had never truly been. Marcus. She opened her front door with an expression of surprised concern. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "I was in the area," I lied. "Thought I'd stop by." She didn't believe me. Colleen had inherited our mother's ability to detect falsehood with almost supernatural accuracy, but she welcomed me in anyway. Her house was modest compared to mine, a 3-bedroom ranch in a working-class neighborhood where children still played in the streets and neighbors knew each other by name. The furniture was comfortable rather than stylish, the walls decorated with family photographs, and the children's artwork rather than original pieces by emerging artists. We sat at her kitchen table with cups of coffee, and Colleen waited with the patience of a woman who spent her professional life coaxing difficult truths from reluctant patients. "I think my marriage is over," I said finally. "Or close to it." She didn't gasp or express shock. She simply nodded. What happened? I told her everything. Dolores's debt, Vivian's ultimatum, the financial discoveries I had made during my investigation. Colleen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more somber as the story unfolded. "I always wondered about her," she said when I finished. "Vivian, I mean. She never seemed real, I guess, like she was performing a part rather than being herself. You never said anything. What was I going to say? Hey, Marcus, your wife seems kind of fake. You were in love. You were happy. Or at least you seemed happy. It wasn't my place to plant doubts." I stared into my coffee cup, watching the steam rise and dissipate. What would you do if you were in my position? Colleen considered the question seriously, as she did everything. "I'd protect the kids first. Whatever you decide about Vivian, Jake and Lily didn't choose any of this. They shouldn't suffer more than necessary because their parents can't work things out." She paused, and I'd be honest with myself about what I actually want. Not what I think I should want, or what would look best to outsiders. What I actually want deep down. What if what I want is to disappear, just walk away from all of it? Then you do that. But you do it honestly, not running away in the middle of the night like a coward. You tell your kids you love them, you make sure they're taken care of, and then you go build whatever new life you need to build. I stayed for dinner with Colleen's family, watching her interact with Patrick and their children with the easy warmth of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. This was what marriage was supposed to look like, I realized, not the careful diplomacy and hidden resentments that characterized my own relationship, but partnership, affection, shared purpose. Somewhere along the way, Vivian and I had lost that, or perhaps we had never truly had it to begin with. The drive back to Westchester took longer than expected due to traffic on Interstate 81. I arrived home close to midnight, expecting Vivian to be asleep. Instead, I found her waiting for me in the living room, still dressed in the elegant casual wear she favored for evenings at home. "Where have you been?" The question carried an edge I wasn't accustomed to hearing. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. "I had to handle some things for a project. It ran late. Your office said you left at noon, so she had called to check on me. That was new. I had meetings outside the office, client consultations. You know how it is." Vivian studied me with the same penetrating attention I had observed her applying to social rivals at charity functions, assessing, calculating, searching for weakness. "Tomorrow is Friday, Marcus. We're supposed to discuss my mother's situation. I'm aware. And do you have an answer?" I met her gaze directly, allowing her to see something she hadn't seen before, the certainty that I was no longer the compliant partner she had grown accustomed to managing. "I have thoughts. We can discuss them tomorrow, as planned." Something flickered in her expression, uncertainty perhaps, or the beginnings of concern. Vivian had spent our entire marriage confident in her ability to shape my decisions through a combination of emotional pressure and social manipulation. She had never encountered resistance, never needed to consider what might happen if I simply refused to play my assigned role. "Fine," she said finally. "Tomorrow, then." I went upstairs to check on Jake and Lily, finding them both asleep in their respective rooms. Jake had his earbuds in, music still playing softly from his phone. Lily was curled around a stuffed elephant she'd had since childhood, looking far younger than her 12 years in the soft glow of her nightlight. I stood in each doorway for several minutes, memorizing their faces, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. Whatever happened next, these two humans were my responsibility. Colleen was right. They hadn't chosen any of this. They deserved better than to become casualties of their parents' failures. Tomorrow would bring the conversation with Vivian. Tomorrow would begin the unraveling of everything I had spent 2 decades building. But tonight, I allowed myself one final moment of pretending that everything was still intact, that my family was still whole, that the future still held the promise of continuity rather than rupture. I slept in the guest room that night, a choice I explained to Vivian as being due to my late arrival and not wanting to disturb her. In truth, I could no longer bear the intimacy of sharing a bed with someone I no longer trusted. The distance had already begun. The sky was a deep purple fading to black when I pulled into the driveway of our home on Friday evening. Vivian had texted earlier to inform me that she had arranged for Jake and Lily to spend the night at friends' houses, a strategic decision that ensured our conversation would proceed without interruption or the need to moderate our voices for young ears. I appreciated her efficiency, even as I recognized it for what it was, preparation for a confrontation she intended to win. The house was quiet when I entered, the kind of deliberate silence that suggested careful staging. Vivian had set the dining room table with our good china, the Bernadotte set her mother had given us as a wedding gift, and lit candles that cast flickering shadows across the walls. A bottle of expensive wine stood open and breathing, and the aroma of roasted lamb drifted from the kitchen. "I thought we should do this properly," Vivian said, emerging from the kitchen in a dress I hadn't seen before, dark blue silk that flattered her figure and probably cost more than my first car. "Whatever we decide tonight, it's important, and important conversations deserve appropriate settings." I couldn't argue with the logic, even if I suspected her true intention was to remind me of everything I stood to lose: the beautiful home, the elegant wife, the comfortable lifestyle that her taste and social connections had helped cultivate. Vivian had always been skilled at environmental manipulation, arranging circumstances to favor her desired outcomes. We sat across from each other at the table, and I allowed her to pour wine and serve the meal before saying anything of substance. The lamb was prepared exactly as I liked it, the vegetables roasted to perfection, the wine a vintage I would have selected myself. She was pulling out every tool in her arsenal. "You've had a week to think," Vivian said finally, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "I assume you've come to a reasonable conclusion." "I've come to a conclusion. Whether you'll consider it reasonable remains to be seen." "Marcus," she sighed, the sound carrying years of practiced exasperation. "I don't want this to become difficult. My mother needs help. We have the resources to provide that help. This should be simple." "Except it isn't simple, Vivian. Nothing about this situation is simple, and pretending otherwise isn't going to make it so." "What are you talking about?" I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, a summary document I had prepared the previous night, outlining the financial irregularities I had discovered in my research. I slid it across the table toward her. $45,000, Vivian. That's how much has disappeared from our accounts over the past 3 years. Transfers, cash withdrawals, payments to accounts I can't identify, roughly $15,000 a year, vanishing into a black hole that I'm guessing leads directly to your mother. Vivian's face went pale beneath her careful makeup, but she maintained her composure with admirable discipline. "I don't know what you think you've found, but please don't insult my intelligence by denying it. I've traced the transactions. I have documentation. The question isn't whether you've been secretly supporting your mother's lifestyle. We both know you have. The question is, why you didn't tell me, and why you're now demanding an additional $350,000, as if we haven't already contributed significantly to this disaster. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of candle flames flickering and the distant hum of the heating system. I watched my wife cycle through several emotional states: denial, anger, calculation, before settling on a defensive resignation. She's my mother, Marcus. What was I supposed to do? Let her suffer? Let her be embarrassed in front of her friends when she couldn't afford to keep up appearances? Keep up appearances. I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its bitterness. That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? Not love, not family obligation, but appearances. The appearance of wealth, the appearance of status, the appearance of a perfect life that neither your mother nor you can actually afford. That's not fair. You don't understand what it was like growing up after my father died, the way people looked at us, pitied us. My mother worked so hard to make sure Gregory and I never felt poor, never felt less than our classmates. So she spent money she didn't have, and when that ran out, she borrowed money she couldn't repay. And you've been enabling that behavior for years, using our money, my money earned through actual work, to prop up a fantasy that benefits no one except your mother's ego. Vivian's composure finally cracked. Your money? Is that what this is about? You think because you earn more than I do, you get to decide how it's spent? I think that decisions about hundreds of thousands of dollars should be made together, openly, with full information. I think that secretly diverting family resources for years without your spouse's knowledge is a form of betrayal. I think that demanding I empty our children's college fund to cover your mother's shopping addiction is unreasonable by any standard. Addiction? Vivian's voice rose sharply. How dare you? What else would you call it? The woman has accumulated $400,000 in debt, buying things she doesn't need to impress people who don't matter. That's not financial mismanagement. That's compulsive behavior that needs treatment, not enablement. We glared at each other across the beautiful table with its beautiful dishes and its beautiful lies. In that moment, I saw our marriage as clearly as I had ever seen it. A gorgeous facade, concealing structural damage that had been accumulating for years, possibly from the very beginning. What do you want me to do? Vivian asked finally, her voice smaller than before. Tell my mother she's on her own? Let her lose her home, her dignity, everything she's worked for? What she's worked for? Vivian, she hasn't worked in 20 years. Everything she has came from your father's pension, from Social Security, and from money she borrowed against a future that never materialized. At some point, the fantasy has to end. The question is whether it ends with a controlled landing or a catastrophic crash. You sound like you've already made up your mind. I took a breath, recognizing that this was the moment I had been building toward all week. I have. I'm not going to pay your mother's debt. Not $350,000, not $100,000, not a single dollar beyond what I've already unwittingly contributed. If you want to use your portion of our marital assets for that purpose during a divorce settlement, that's your choice. But I'm not going to voluntarily destroy our family's financial security to enable a problem you and your mother created through years of dishonesty. The word divorce landed like a physical blow. Vivian's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. You're talking about ending our marriage because I wanted to help my mother. I'm talking about ending a marriage that has apparently been built on deception from the beginning. The money is almost beside the point, Vivian. You've been lying to me for years. You've been manipulating our finances behind my back. You demanded I make an enormous sacrifice without ever acknowledging the sacrifices you'd already required of me, without my knowledge. How am I supposed to trust you after this? How am I supposed to continue in a partnership where my partner treats me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected? I never thought of you that way. Maybe not consciously, but look at how you approached this situation. You didn't come to me with honesty saying, Marcus, I've been helping my mother for years. The situation has gotten out of control and I need your help figuring out what to do. You came to me with an ultimatum, expecting me to write a check and not ask questions. That's not how partners treat each other. That's how users treat marks. Vivian was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks and ruining her mascara. Part of me felt sympathy. She was still the woman I had loved for 15 years, the mother of my children, a human being in obvious pain. But a larger part of me recognized that tears were another tool in her arsenal, another manipulation designed to soften my resolve. "What about the kids?" she asked. "What happens to Jake and Lily if we do this?" "They remain my primary concern, as they've always been. We work out an arrangement that minimizes disruption to their lives. We don't use them as weapons against each other. We behave like civilized adults who happen to be ending a marriage, not enemies in a war. And the house, the life we've built? Those are details to be worked out with attorneys. I'm not trying to punish you, Vivian. I'm trying to protect myself and our children from a situation that has become untenable. If there's a way to do this that allows you to maintain dignity and stability, I'm open to it. But not at the cost of everything I've worked for." We sat in silence for a long time after that, the candles burning lower, the food growing cold on our plates. The romantic dinner Vivian had staged had become something else entirely, a funeral meal for a marriage that had died long before either of us had the courage to acknowledge it. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to figure out what I'm going to do. Take whatever time you need. But I want to be clear about one thing. If you attempt to drain our accounts or take any unilateral financial actions without my agreement, I will pursue every legal remedy available to me. I've already consulted with an attorney. I know my rights, and I'm prepared to defend them." Vivian looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, not the reliable, manageable husband she had grown accustomed to, but someone else entirely. Someone harder, more determined, less willing to accommodate her needs at the expense of his own. "When did you become this person?" she asked quietly. "I've always been this person, Vivian. You just never had reason to notice." The following 3 weeks were an exercise in parallel living. Vivian and I occupied the same house, but moved through separate orbits, our paths crossing only when necessary for coordinating the children's activities or maintaining the appearance of normalcy. We had agreed to keep our situation private until we had a clearer picture of how to proceed. Neither of us wanted Jake and Lily to spend their holiday season worrying about their parents' marriage. During this interregnum, I continued my preparations with methodical precision. Raymond Castellano delivered his preliminary report, confirming my suspicions and adding details I hadn't anticipated. The hotel charges on Vivian's credit card corresponded to meetings with a man named Jeffrey Blackwood, an investment banker she had met through one of her charity boards. Their relationship appeared to have been ongoing for approximately 18 months, though Raymond cautioned that the evidence was circumstantial and might not meet the standards required for formal legal proceedings. I received this information with surprising equanimity. The betrayal had already occurred in my mind. The specific details were merely footnotes to a story I had already understood in its essential shape. If anything, the affair simplified my emotional calculations. I no longer needed to wonder whether I was overreacting to the financial deception. There were now multiple categories of betrayal to consider. More significant were Raymond's findings regarding Vivian's financial situation. She had opened a separate bank account 3 years earlier, funded by the diverted funds from our joint accounts, as well as additional sources Raymond was still investigating. The current balance was approximately $78,000, a nest egg she had presumably built in case she ever needed to leave our marriage on her own terms. "Looks like she's been planning her own exit strategy," Raymond observed during our second meeting, "or at least keeping her options open." "The irony isn't lost on me," I replied. I spent my evenings in my study, refining my own plans. The outline had begun to take shape during my drive back from Scranton and had solidified in the days following my confrontation with Vivian. I was going to disappear, not in the dramatic sense of faking my death or fleeing prosecution, but in the more mundane sense of extracting myself entirely from my current life and building something new elsewhere. The logistics were more complex than popular culture would suggest. I had financial obligations that needed to be addressed, professional responsibilities that required proper transition, and most importantly, I had children who deserved better than a father who simply evaporated without explanation. True disappearance wasn't the goal. Selective disconnection was. I began by engaging a second attorney, this one in Charleston, South Carolina, a city I had always loved, and which offered both professional opportunities and sufficient distance from my current circumstances. This attorney, Madeline Foster, specialized in helping clients manage complex life transitions, including the discreet liquidation of assets and the establishment of new business entities. "You're talking about a significant restructuring," Madeline observed during our initial consultation. "Not illegal, but certainly unorthodox. Most people going through divorce fight over assets. You're proposing to divide them preemptively and voluntarily. I'm proposing to take what's fairly mine and leave what's fairly hers. The house, the retirement accounts, those can be divided according to whatever formula the court determines. But my personal earnings going forward, my ability to rebuild elsewhere, those belong to me. And the children. I'll maintain my relationship with Jake and Lily regardless of geography. I'll pay child support, fulfill my obligations, remain involved in their lives, but I won't remain trapped in a marriage or a community that has nothing left to offer me." Madeline accepted my case with the professional detachment of someone accustomed to unusual requests. She began the process of establishing a new business entity in South Carolina, a small architectural consulting firm that would allow me to continue working while maintaining separation from my current professional entanglements. The hardest conversation was with my children. I chose a Sunday afternoon in early December when Vivian was at her tennis clinic and the house was quiet. I took Jake and Lily to our favorite diner in town, a place we had been visiting since they were small, and told them as much truth as I thought they could handle. "Your mom and I are going through some difficulties," I said, watching their faces for signs of distress. "We haven't made any final decisions yet, but I want you both to know that whatever happens, I love you more than anything in the world, and that will never change." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Are you getting divorced?" "We're considering it. We're trying to figure out what's best for everyone." Jake, ever the stoic, studied his plate with intense concentration. "Is it about the money stuff? Grandma's debt? That's part of it. There are other things too, adult things, that are complicated to explain, but none of it is your fault, and none of it changes how much your mom and I love you." "Will we have to move?" Lily asked. "Will I have to change schools? Your mom will stay in the house for now. You'll stay in your schools, keep your friends, maintain your activities. The biggest change might be where I live, but I'll always be available to you. Always." The conversation continued for another hour, covering questions and concerns and reassurances. By the end, both children understood that their family was changing but not ending, that both parents remained committed to their well-being, even if the marriage itself could not be salvaged. I drove them home, feeling both depleted and relieved. The hardest part of my plan was now complete. Everything else was just logistics. The final piece fell into place 2 weeks before Christmas. I received a call from a former colleague, Nathan Driscoll, who had moved to Charleston several years earlier to start his own firm. Nathan had heard through professional channels that I might be looking for new opportunities and wanted to discuss a partnership. "We're growing faster than we can handle," he explained. "The Southeast construction market is booming, and we need someone with your experience in large-scale residential and commercial projects. It would mean starting over in some ways, but the potential is enormous." I flew to Charleston the following weekend, ostensibly for a client meeting that Vivian didn't question. Nathan showed me around his operation, a mid-sized firm with impressive projects and an enthusiastic young staff, and made a formal offer that exceeded my expectations. I would join as a senior partner with equity stake, bringing my expertise and client relationships in exchange for a significant ownership position. "When can you start?" Nathan asked. "January, after the holidays." We shook hands on the agreement, and I returned to New York with my departure date fixed in my mind like a destination on a map. 3 weeks remained of my current life. 3 weeks to tie up loose ends, say necessary goodbyes, and prepare for a future that remained undefined, but felt, for the first time in months, full of possibility. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday, a sentiment that traced back to childhood memories of modest celebrations in our Scranton home. The carefully chosen gifts my parents could barely afford, the meals my mother prepared with obvious love, the warmth that seemed to radiate from our small house despite the Pennsylvania winter pressing against the windows. I had tried to recreate that warmth in my own family, hosting elaborate celebrations that brought together Vivian's relatives and occasionally my own, filling our Westchester home with food and laughter and the kind of controlled chaos that children thrive on. This Christmas felt different. The decorations were the same. The 12-foot tree Vivian had selected from the local nursery, the wreaths and garlands that transformed our colonial into something from a holiday catalogue. But the atmosphere beneath the surface was one of suspended animation. Everyone moved through their roles with determined cheerfulness, nobody acknowledging the fault lines that had become impossible to ignore. Vivian and I had reached an unspoken arrangement. We would maintain appearances through the holidays for the children's sake, then address our situation in the new year. It was a temporary armistice, fragile as spun glass, but it allowed us to function without open conflict. We slept in the same bed again, though we occupied opposite edges of the mattress like hostile nations sharing a disputed border. On Christmas Eve, we hosted our annual party, a tradition Vivian had established in the second year of our marriage and maintained with unwavering dedication ever since. Neighbors, colleagues, members of Vivian's various boards and committees filled our home, circulating through rooms decorated to perfection, sampling catered hors d'oeuvres and expensive wine. I played my role as the successful husband with increasingly hollow conviction, making small talk with people I would likely never see again after the holiday season concluded. Dolores Fairbanks arrived fashionably late, resplendent in a new designer outfit that presumably represented additional debt on her already catastrophic balance sheet. She kissed my cheek with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to being both adored and accommodated. "Marcus, darling, the house looks magnificent, as always." "Thank you, Dolores. I hope your trip from Florida was pleasant." "First class, of course. I refuse to be cramped into those terrible economy seats. My chiropractor would never forgive me." I smiled and excused myself, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on refreshments. The encounter was typical of my interactions with Dolores, surface-level pleasantries masking profound differences in values and expectations. She had never particularly liked me, I suspected, viewing me as serviceable but socially inferior to the kind of husband her daughter might have attracted if she had aimed higher. My utility lay in my earning capacity and my willingness to fund the lifestyle she believed her daughter deserved. Gregory Fairbanks, Vivian's brother, found me in the kitchen helping the catering staff arrange a fresh tray of crab cakes. Gregory was a pleasant enough man, if somewhat ineffectual, a middle manager at a pharmaceutical company who had never quite achieved the success his family believed was his birthright. His wife, Miranda, had the strained look of a woman who spent much of her energy managing her husband's insecurities while raising their twin daughters on an income that didn't quite match their aspirations. "Hell of a party, Marcus," Gregory said, helping himself to a glass of wine from the counter. "You guys always know how to do it up right." "Vivian deserves the credit. I just signed the checks." Gregory laughed, apparently not recognizing the bitterness beneath the humor. "Speaking of which, I wanted to thank you for being willing to help with Mom's situation. I know it's a lot to ask. I looked at him carefully, wondering how much he actually knew about the current state of affairs. What has Vivian told you about that? Just that you're working on a plan. Something about liquidating some investments, restructuring things to come up with the money. It's really generous of you, Marcus. The whole family appreciates it. So Vivian had been spinning narratives behind my back, managing her family's expectations in ways that would make my eventual refusal look like a betrayal of promised commitments. It was a sophisticated manipulation, positioning me as the villain in a story where she had already cast herself as the disappointed hero. Plans are still being finalized, I said carefully. I wouldn't count any chickens just yet. Of course, these things take time. Gregory clapped me on the shoulder with the forced camaraderie of someone who wanted something and was working his way up to asking for it. But seriously, Marcus, you're a good man, better than I probably deserve as a brother-in-law. If there's ever anything I can do for you, just say the word. I thanked him and extracted myself from the conversation, wondering what Gregory's response would be when the truth emerged. Would he blame me for not fulfilling promises I had never made, or would he recognize that his sister had been managing all of them? Husband, brother, mother, like chess pieces in a game of her own design? The party continued until nearly midnight, guests departing in waves as the hour grew late and the wine supply dwindled. Vivian and I stood at the door saying goodbyes, our arms touching in the way of longtime spouses, presenting the image of partnership even as the reality crumbled behind the facade. Finally, only family remained. Dolores ensconced in the guest room downstairs, Gregory and Miranda similarly settled in the room across the hall, Jake and Lily finally in bed after hours of excitement and sugar. Vivian and I retreated to our bedroom in exhausted silence, changing into sleepwear and preparing for the performance that would continue in the morning. It was a good party, Vivian said, as she removed her makeup at the vanity. People seemed to enjoy themselves. They always do. You know how to throw an event. Thank you. She met my eyes in the mirror. I know things have been difficult between us, but I wanted you to know that I appreciate you going along with all this. For the kids' sake, I agreed. We climbed into bed on our respective sides, maintaining the careful distance that had become our norm. In the darkness, I could hear Vivian's breathing gradually slow as she drifted towards sleep, while I lay awake contemplating the mathematics of departure. January 15th. That was my target date. 3 weeks from now. Nathan Driscoll expected me in Charleston by the Martin Luther King holiday weekend, and I had arranged my affairs accordingly. The new bank accounts were funded, the new business entity established, the apartment I had rented sight unseen was waiting for my arrival. My resignation letter to Brennan and Associates sat in my desk drawer, ready to be submitted on January 10th, the latest possible date that would still give them time to transition my projects without undue hardship. What remained was the conversation with Vivian, not the divorce proceedings themselves. Those would follow according to their own timeline, managed by attorneys and court schedules, but the initial revelation that I was leaving. Not just the marriage, but the city, the life, the entire structure we had built together over 15 years. I had considered various approaches to this conversation. The direct method, sitting her down and explaining my plans in clinical detail. The indirect method, leaving documentation and a letter, allowing her to absorb the information privately before any face-to-face discussion. The cowardly method, simply disappearing and letting the attorneys handle the aftermath. Each approach had advantages and drawbacks. The direct method would give Vivian opportunities for emotional manipulation, for arguments and bargaining, and the deployment of tactics she had refined over 15 years of marriage. The indirect method felt impersonal, reducing the end of our partnership to paperwork. The cowardly method was, well, cowardly, an abdication of responsibility that would haunt me regardless of its tactical efficiency. I was still wrestling with these options when sleep finally claimed me, pulling me into dreams where I walked through an endless house with no exits, opening door after door, only to find the same room waiting behind each one. Christmas morning arrived with the usual chaos of excited children and torn wrapping paper. Jake and Lily had reached ages where the magic of Santa Claus had faded into knowing appreciation, but they still threw themselves into gift opening with enthusiasm that reminded me of simpler times. Dolores presided over the proceedings from the most comfortable chair in the living room, accepting tribute like a queen at court. The cashmere scarf from Vivian, the expensive perfume from Gregory, the thoughtful book collection from me that I had selected before everything fell apart. The gifts I had chosen for my children carried particular weight this year, though they couldn't know it. For Jake, I had found a vintage Gibson acoustic guitar from a specialty shop in the city, an instrument of genuine quality that would serve him for decades if he continued his musical pursuits. For Lily, I had commissioned a custom jewelry box from a craftsman in Vermont, its interior compartments designed to grow with her as she transitioned from girl to young woman. "Dad, this is amazing," Jake said, cradling the guitar with obvious reverence. "How did you even find this?" "I have my sources. There's a shop in Brooklyn that specializes in vintage instruments. The owner knew I was looking for something special." Lily threw her arms around me in a hug that lasted longer than her usual embraces. "I love it, Daddy. It's perfect." I held my daughter close, memorizing the feeling of her arms around my neck, the smell of her shampoo, the particular way she tucked her head against my shoulder. In 3 weeks, these casual moments of physical affection would become scheduled events, regulated by custody agreements and geographic distance. I was trading daily presence for eventual freedom, and the equation did not balance as cleanly as I had hoped. The day proceeded through its familiar rituals: brunch prepared by Vivian and Miranda, the exchange of additional gifts between adults, an afternoon walk through the neighborhood to admire the decorations on neighboring houses. Dolores held court throughout, dispensing opinions on everything from the quality of the food to the clothing choices of passers-by. "You really should consider updating the landscaping, Vivian," she observed as we passed a house with elaborate hardscaping and professional lighting. "Something more contemporary. This colonial aesthetic is becoming rather dated." "We like our landscaping," I said, before Vivian could respond. "It suits the house." Dolores gave me the look she reserved for comments she considered beneath acknowledgement, and continued her critique without missing a beat. I watched Vivian navigate the dynamic with her usual diplomacy, redirecting conversation without directly contradicting her mother, keeping peace through strategic accommodation. It struck me, not for the first time, that Vivian had spent her entire life managing Dolores, anticipating needs, smoothing conflicts, sacrificing her own preferences to maintain harmony. The financial deception that had triggered our current crisis was, in some sense, simply an extension of patterns established in childhood. Vivian had learned early that keeping her mother happy required resources she didn't always possess, and she had carried that lesson into adulthood with devastating consequences. Understanding this didn't change my decision, but it added a layer of melancholy to the proceedings. Vivian wasn't a villain in some simple morality play. She was a person shaped by circumstances, making choices that seemed reasonable within her frame of reference, even when they caused harm to others. I had been collateral damage in a conflict that predated our relationship, caught in currents I hadn't recognized until they had already carried me far from shore. That evening, after Dolores and the Fairbanks contingent had retired to their rooms, I found myself alone in my study with a glass of whiskey and my thoughts. The house was quiet, except for the settling sounds of old wood and the distant hum of the heating system. Christmas lights blinked outside my window, creating patterns on the snow that had begun falling earlier in the afternoon. My phone buzzed with a text from Colleen. "Merry Christmas from all of us. Hope you're surviving. Call when you can." I typed back, "Surviving. Plans proceeding. Will call tomorrow." Her response came quickly. "Proud of you. Whatever happens." The simple message carried more weight than its few words suggested. Colleen had been my anchor throughout this process, providing perspective and support without judgment. She understood, in ways that Vivian never had, that I was not simply a role to be performed. Successful husband, reliable provider, accommodating son-in-law, but a person with needs and limits of my own. I thought about the years ahead. Jake would be in college before long, beginning his own journey toward adulthood. Lily would follow 4 years later. My role as their daily parent was already transitioning into something more advisory, more distant. The distance I was about to create would accelerate that transition, but it wouldn't fundamentally alter the trajectory. What would alter was my relationship with myself. For too long, I had defined my identity through my roles: architect, husband, father, provider, rather than through any internal sense of who I actually was. The disappearance I was planning was, in a sense, an attempt to strip away those external definitions and discover what remained underneath. The whiskey was smooth and expensive, a gift from a client who knew my tastes. I savored it slowly, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill, thinking about Charleston and Nathan and the new life waiting for me there. It wouldn't be perfect. Nothing ever was. But it would be mine in a way this life had never truly been. Tomorrow, the Fairbanks contingent would depart, returning to their respective homes and their respective delusions. I would have 2 more weeks to prepare, to handle final details, to steel myself for the conversations that would need to happen. And then, like the snow now covering the landscape, I would gently and inexorably transform the terrain of my existence into something unrecognizable from what had come before. January arrived with bitter cold and the return of routine. The holidays receded into memory, their forced cheer giving way to the grimmer business of winter survival. Vivian resumed her committee meetings and tennis lessons. Jake and Lily returned to school. I went through the motions at Brennan and Associates while quietly preparing for my exit. On January 10th, as planned, I submitted my resignation. The partners received the news with shock that gradually transformed into something more complex, understanding, perhaps, that my decision reflected circumstances beyond professional dissatisfaction. "I've heard rumors," said Evan Brennan, the firm's founder and my mentor for nearly 2 decades. "Nothing specific, but are you all right, Marcus?" "I will be. This is something I need to do. The opportunity in Charleston is significant, and there are personal factors that make a change of scenery advisable." Evan nodded slowly, his experienced eyes reading between the lines of what I was willing to say. "I understand. You've been an extraordinary asset to this firm, and we'll miss you, but sometimes a man needs to rebuild his life from new foundations. I hope you find what you're looking for." We shook hands with genuine warmth, and I felt a pang of regret that I was leaving behind relationships that had sustained me through difficult years. Brennan and Associates had been more than an employer. It had been a community, a place where my abilities were recognized and valued. That recognition had, ironically, made it easier to be taken for granted at home. Why worry about Marcus's emotional needs when he seemed so fulfilled by his career? The following days were consumed by transition activities. I briefed colleagues on my ongoing projects, documented procedures and client relationships, ensured that my departure would not leave unfinished business or abandoned commitments. It was the same thoroughness I had applied to every professional undertaking, the same attention to detail that had built my reputation and my career. What I did not do was tell Vivian. The conversation I had been dreading remained unscheduled, pushed forward day by day as I wrestled with how to approach it. I had drafted and discarded a dozen versions of the speech I would give her, none of them capturing the complexity of what I needed to convey. On January 14th, the day before my planned departure, I made a decision. I would not have the conversation at all. I would leave a letter instead, explaining my reasons and outlining the practical arrangements I had made for the children and for the financial separation. The attorneys could handle the rest. This choice felt like cowardice, and perhaps it was. But I had come to understand that any direct confrontation with Vivian would devolve into the same patterns that had characterized our marriage from the beginning. Her manipulation of emotional dynamics, my accommodation of demands I knew were unreasonable, a final compromise that left me diminished and her in control. The only way to break those patterns was to remove myself from the equation before they could begin. I wrote the letter that evening, sitting in my study while Vivian attended a charity board meeting and the children did homework in their rooms. The words came more easily than I had expected, flowing from a clarity that had been building for months. Vivian, by the time you read this, I will have left for Charleston, South Carolina, where I am beginning a new position with an architectural firm. This is not a decision I have made impulsively. It is the result of careful consideration over many months, triggered initially by the revelations regarding your mother's debt, but ultimately rooted in much deeper concerns about our relationship. I have discovered the extent of the financial deception you have conducted throughout our marriage, the secret transfers to your mother, the private bank account, the hotel charges that suggest additional betrayals I do not wish to explore further. These discoveries have made it impossible for me to continue in a partnership that was apparently never the partnership I believed it to be. I am not abandoning our children. I have retained attorneys who will work with your attorneys to establish custody arrangements that protect Jake and Lily's well-being while allowing me to maintain a meaningful relationship with them. I will meet all financial obligations regarding child support and will continue contributing to their education and welfare. What I will not do is continue to fund your mother's lifestyle or sacrifice our children's future to cover debts that were accumulated through irresponsibility and sustained through deception. The decision about how to handle Dolores' situation is now yours to make, using whatever resources you have access to after our marital assets are divided. I do not hate you, Vivian. I recognize that you are a product of circumstances and influences that shaped you long before we met. But I cannot remain in a marriage where I am treated as a resource rather than a partner, where my needs are subordinated to your family's expectations, where the foundation of our relationship is revealed to be something other than what I was led to believe. I wish you well. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but I will not be finding it with you. Marcus. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, which I left on the kitchen counter where Vivian would find it in the morning. Then I went upstairs to check on my children one last time. Jake was in bed with his earbuds in, probably listening to music or a podcast. I knocked on his doorframe and entered when he removed one earbud. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" "Nothing specific. Just wanted to say goodnight." He looked at me with the particular perception that teenagers sometimes display, the ability to sense undercurrents that adults believe they are concealing. "You sure everything's okay?" "Everything's complicated, but it's going to be okay, I promise you that." "Okay." He replaced the earbud, then paused. "Hey, Dad, thanks for the guitar. I really love it." "I know you do, buddy. You're welcome." Lily was reading in her bed, her stuffed elephant tucked beside her as always. At 12, she was beginning to show signs of the woman she would become, her mother's features softening with something kinder, something more generous. "Daddy," she looked up from her book. "Are you crying?" I hadn't realized I was. I wiped my eyes quickly. "No, sweetie, just tired. It's been a long week. Mum says you're working too hard. She says architects never know when to stop. Your mother might be right about that." I sat on the edge of her bed and brushed hair from her forehead. "Lily, I want you to know something. No matter what happens, no matter how things change, I love you more than anything in the world. You understand that?" "Of course, Daddy. I love you too." I kissed her forehead and left her to her reading, closing the door softly behind me. In the hallway, I stood for a long moment, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. Jake and Lily at various ages, family vacations, holiday gatherings. 15 years of memories preserved in frames, soon to become artifacts of a past that no longer connected to the present. I went to bed early that night, pleading exhaustion when Vivian returned from her meeting. She accepted the excuse without question, settling into her side of the bed and falling asleep within minutes. I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing, trying to remember what it had felt like to love her, truly love her, without qualification or doubt. The feeling was there, buried under layers of disappointment and betrayal, but it no longer had the power to change my course. Love, I had learned, was not always enough. Sometimes survival required walking away from everything you thought you wanted, towards something unknown but necessary. At 4 in the morning, I rose quietly and dressed in the darkness. My suitcase was already in my car, packed days earlier under the pretense of a business trip. I took one last look around the bedroom. Vivian's sleeping form, the furniture we had chosen together, the life we had built on foundations that had proven inadequate. And then I walked out. The house was silent as I moved through it, collecting my laptop, my briefcase, a few final items I had left until the last moment. I paused at the kitchen counter, where the letter waited, confirming its presence, ensuring it would be found. Then I opened the front door, stepped into the cold January darkness, and began my disappearance. The drive south took 14 hours, with stops for fuel and coffee and the occasional moment of doubt that required pulling over and talking myself through the decision I had made. By the time I crossed into South Carolina, the sun was setting over a landscape so different from the grey winter of New York that it felt like entering another country entirely. Charleston welcomed me with moderate temperatures, Spanish moss hanging from ancient trees, and the particular quality of light that painters had been trying to capture for centuries. I had visited the city several times over the years, for conferences, for projects, for brief escapes from my regular life, and had always felt a connection to its unhurried pace and layered history. Now that connection would be tested by the demands of daily residence. The apartment I had rented was in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of the historic district, a loft-style space with exposed brick and high ceilings that appealed to my architectural sensibilities. It was smaller than any residence I had occupied since graduate school, but it felt appropriate, a clean slate, a minimal canvas on which to rebuild. Nathan Driscoll met me the following morning at his office, a renovated building on King Street that housed Driscoll Architects and its 30-person staff. He was taller than I remembered, with the weathered look of someone who spent weekends sailing and the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his environment. "Welcome to Charleston, Marcus. How are you holding up? Ask me in a month. Right now, I'm running on adrenaline and caffeine." Nathan laughed. "Fair enough. Let me show you around, introduce you to the team, and then we can talk about the projects waiting for your attention." The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of work and adjustment. My role at Driscoll Architects was both familiar and novel. Familiar in its professional demands, novel in its context and culture. The firm's projects tended toward the residential and boutique commercial, a contrast to the massive developments I had overseen in New York. The clients were different too, more interested in heritage preservation and environmental integration than the dramatic statements favored by Manhattan developers. I found the work satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was something healing about designing homes rather than towers, creating spaces where families would live and grow rather than units to be bought and sold by investors. Each project felt personal in a way that my New York work rarely had. Communication with my children was more difficult. Our first phone conversation after my departure was an exercise in damage control, both Jake and Lily struggling to understand why their father had left without warning or explanation. "Why didn't you tell us?" Lily asked, her voice trembling with hurt. "Why did you just leave?" "Because I was afraid that if I tried to explain in person, I would change my mind. And I needed to not change my mind, sweetie. I needed to make a change that was long overdue. Do you hate Mom?" "No, I don't hate anyone. Sometimes marriages end, not because of hate, but because people grow in different directions. Your mother and I want different things from life, and we couldn't figure out how to want those things together." Jake was less vocal about his feelings, retreating into the teenage stoicism that I recognized from my own adolescence. Our conversations were shorter, more stilted, punctuated by long silences that I didn't know how to fill. "I'm not asking you to understand right now," I told him during one of these difficult calls. "I'm asking you to trust that I had reasons, and that my love for you and your sister is not diminished by any of this." "Okay, Dad." His voice was flat, non-committal. "I should go. I have homework." These conversations left me emotionally depleted, questioning whether the freedom I had purchased was worth the cost. But I reminded myself that parental relationships are long arcs, not single moments. Jake and Lily would have years to process what had happened, to form their own understandings of their parents' choices. My job was to remain present and available, to demonstrate through consistent action that my departure from their mother was not an abandonment of them. Vivian's response to my disappearance was initially volcanic, if my attorney's reports were accurate. She had apparently discovered the letter on the morning of January 15th and immediately tried calling my phone, which I had replaced with a new number. Her subsequent attempts to locate me through professional and social networks were frustrated by the preparations I had made, the deliberate disconnection that left no obvious trail. Her attorneys eventually made contact with mine, and the formal proceedings began. The divorce itself was relatively straightforward. New York's equitable distribution framework, combined with the documentation I had compiled regarding Vivian's financial deceptions, gave me strong negotiating position. The primary disputes centered on custody arrangements and the disposition of the house. I agreed to joint custody with Vivian as the primary residential parent, a concession that reflected both geographic reality and my genuine belief that Jake and Lily needed the stability of remaining in their home and schools. I would have them during school breaks and for extended periods during the summer, with regular video calls between visits. The house I ceded to Vivian entirely, along with my share of the retirement accounts, a significant financial sacrifice, but one that simplified the proceedings and allowed me to achieve clean separation. What I retained were the liquid assets I had positioned before my departure, plus my ongoing earning capacity in my new role. "You're giving up more than you need to," my attorney observed during one of our consultations. "The evidence of financial misconduct would support a much more favorable division." "I'm not interested in punishing her. I'm interested in moving forward. Whatever she gets from this marriage, she'll need. Her mother's situation hasn't improved, and she's going to be managing that burden for years to come, with your money, with money that stopped feeling like mine a long time ago. The price of freedom isn't measured in dollars, counselor. It's measured in peace of mind." Spring arrived in Charleston with an explosion of color that seemed almost excessive after the muted palette of northeastern winters. Azaleas and dogwoods bloomed along every street, their flowers creating canopies of pink and white that transformed my daily commute into something approaching the magical. I found myself walking more, driving less, allowing the city to work its particular healing on my fractured sense of self. Work continued to provide structure and purpose. The project that occupied most of my attention was a residential compound on one of the barrier islands, a family retreat designed to withstand hurricanes while celebrating the natural beauty of the coastal environment. The clients, a multi-generational family with roots in Charleston dating back to the colonial period, wanted something that honored tradition without sacrificing modern functionality. It was the kind of assignment I would never have received in New York, where my reputation was tied to large-scale commercial developments rather than intimate residential work. Here, freed from established expectations, I could explore different aspects of my professional capabilities. The design that emerged was something I was genuinely proud of, responsive to its environment, respectful of local building traditions, innovative in its approach to sustainability and resilience. "This is exceptional work," Nathan observed during a design review. "You've managed to capture something essential about the low country aesthetic while creating something entirely original." The clients are going to love it. The validation felt different than it had in my previous career. In New York, praise from partners and clients had been expected, almost obligatory. A successful project was simply the minimum standard of professional performance. Here, compliments carried genuine weight, reflecting appreciation for contributions that weren't taken for granted. I began making friends in my new environment, something I hadn't done since graduate school. There was James, a bartender at a restaurant near my apartment who had an encyclopedic knowledge of bourbon and a cynical wit that made long evenings at his bar feel like conversations with an old friend. There was Patricia, a colleague at the firm who specialized in historical restoration and shared my interest in the intersection of old and new construction. There was Samuel, a neighbor in my building who taught literature at the College of Charleston and introduced me to a reading group that met monthly to discuss books I had always intended to read but never found time for. These relationships were deliberately superficial at first, guarded by the wariness of someone who had learned hard lessons about trust. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, I allowed myself to lower those guards, to share aspects of my story with people who had no stake in its outcome. "So you just left?" James asked one evening, after I had given him an abbreviated version of my circumstances. "No conversation, no negotiation, just gone?" "More or less. I know how it sounds. It sounds like a man who reached his breaking point and did what he had to do. No judgment here. I've had my own breaking points, different circumstances, but the same fundamental choice. Stay and break completely, or leave and start breaking down differently." That's remarkably philosophical for a bartender. I have a master's degree in psychology. Didn't want to spend my life in institutions, so I tend bar instead. The hours are better, and the conversations are more honest. Patricia's perspective was different, shaped by her experience as a divorced woman navigating single parenthood. "The guilt never entirely goes away," she told me during a late-night conversation at a firm social event. "You learn to live with it, to contextualize it, but it remains there like a splinter you can't quite remove. The question is whether the guilt of leaving is worse than the guilt of staying in something that's slowly destroying you. What about your kids? Did they forgive you?" "Eventually. It took years. My son didn't speak to me for almost 2 years after the divorce. He blamed me entirely, saw his father as the victim, couldn't understand why I had made the choice I made. Then he went through his own difficult relationship, and suddenly he understood things he hadn't been able to understand before. Now we're closer than we were when he was a child." These conversations helped me contextualize my own experience, to see it as something other than a unique moral failure. Marriages end for countless reasons, and while the manner of my departure was perhaps unusual, the underlying dynamics were as old as the institution itself. My children visited for the first time in late March during their spring break. I had prepared obsessively for their arrival, cleaning the apartment until it gleamed, researching activities and restaurants appropriate for their ages and interests, trying to anticipate every possible need or concern. The anxiety I felt in the days before their flight rivaled anything I had experienced in my professional career. Jake arrived with the cautious wariness I had expected, maintaining emotional distance that felt like protective armor. Lily was more openly affectionate, throwing her arms around me at the airport with enthusiasm that brought tears to my eyes. "I missed you, Daddy," she said into my chest. "The house feels weird without you." "I missed you too, sweetheart, more than you can possibly know." The week that followed was both wonderful and difficult. Wonderful because I was with my children, sharing their company, and watching them experience a city I had come to love. Difficult because every moment carried the weight of what had been lost, what had been chosen, what could never be returned to its previous form. We toured historic sites and ate seafood on the waterfront. We took a boat ride to Fort Sumter and discussed the Civil War with Jake, who was studying that period in school. We walked through the colorful streets of the French Quarter and browsed shops where Lily found earrings she loved and I happily purchased. On their last evening, we sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city's distinctive skyline. Jake had gradually thawed over the course of the week, and now he sat beside me with something approaching the ease we had shared before everything fell apart. "Dad," his voice was thoughtful, considering. "I think I understand why you left. Not entirely, but sort of. Tell me what you understand." "Mums, she can be a lot. Like she has all these expectations about how things should be, and if they're not that way, she's disappointed, and she doesn't really see that she's doing it. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense. I think maybe you got tired of being disappointed of never quite being enough, even when you were doing everything right." The insight was more profound than I would have expected from a 15-year-old, and I realized I had been underestimating my son's perceptiveness all along. "That's part of it," I admitted. "Not all of it, but a significant part. Thanks for not lying about it. Mom keeps saying everything was fine until you decided to have a midlife crisis. It's kind of nice to hear a different perspective. Your mother sees things differently than I do. That doesn't make her wrong necessarily, just different. You'll have to form your own understanding over time." Jake nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. We sat in companionable silence until the sun finished its descent and the evening stars began appearing over the Atlantic. The months that followed established patterns that would define my new existence. Work, friendship, the gradual accretion of routines and preferences that constitute a life. Summer brought my children for 6 weeks, during which I had the privilege of being their daily parent again, driving them to activities, helping with summer reading assignments, arguing about bedtimes and screen time, and all the ordinary negotiations of family life. During this visit, something shifted in my relationship with Jake and Lily. The formal visits of spring gave way to something more organic, more natural. We weren't performing family anymore. We were being family in whatever imperfect form our circumstances allowed. Lily flourished in Charleston's relaxed environment, making friends with children in my building and discovering a passion for the beach that had been constrained by our landlocked existence in Westchester. She spent hours in the surf, emerging sun-browned and exhilarated, chattering about waves and sandcastles and the particular species of birds she had observed. Jake, at 16, was more complex. He had graduated from cautious acceptance to something closer to genuine engagement, but he remained guarded in ways that reminded me of myself at that age. One evening, during a walk along the Battery, he asked questions I had been expecting but dreading. "Dad, are you happy here? Like, actually happy? Not just pretending?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "I'm getting there. Happiness isn't a destination you arrive at and stay forever. It's more like weather, changing from day to day. Some days I'm very happy. Some days I'm lonely, or sad, or uncertain. But overall, this feels more like the life I'm supposed to be living than what I had before. Do you ever regret leaving?" "I regret the way I left. The letter, the lack of conversation. That wasn't fair to anyone, especially not to you and your sister. If I could do it again, I would handle that part differently. But leaving itself? No. That was necessary, even if the execution was flawed." Jake absorbed this, processing in the deliberate way that characterized his approach to complex information. "Mom started seeing someone," he said finally. "A guy named Jeffrey. She doesn't know I know, but I'm not stupid." The name struck me like a physical blow, though I tried not to show it. Jeffrey Blackwood, the man from the hotel receipts, the affair that had preceded my departure. Vivian was apparently continuing what had begun before our marriage ended. "How do you feel about that?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Weird, like I know you guys are divorced and she's allowed to date, but it still feels like a betrayal, you know? Like she's replacing you." "She's not replacing me. Nobody can replace a parent. Whatever relationship she develops with this Jeffrey or anyone else, it doesn't change the fact that I'm your father and always will be." "That's what Mom says too, but it still feels weird." "Weird is okay. Feelings don't have to be logical. You're allowed to feel however you feel about it." We walked in silence for a while, the lights of the harbor shimmering on the water. Eventually, Jake spoke again. "Dad, I'm glad you're happy, or getting there, or whatever. And I'm glad I can come here and visit, and it feels normal. I was really angry when you first left, but I think I get it now, more than I did. Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you know." The summer ended too quickly, as summers always do. I drove Jake and Lily to the airport on a humid August morning, helping them with their bags and offering the hugs that had become more natural over 6 weeks of proximity. "I'll see you at Thanksgiving," I promised, "and you can call any time, video chat whenever you want." "We know, Dad." Lily rolled her eyes with affectionate exasperation. "You say that every time." "Because it's always true." I watched them disappear through security, feeling the particular emptiness that comes when children depart after extended visits. The apartment would seem larger now, the evenings longer, the silences more profound. But these were familiar sensations, manageable in ways they hadn't been the previous year. My life had achieved a kind of equilibrium, not perfection certainly, but sustainability. Work continued to satisfy. Friendships continued to deepen. The city continued to reveal new dimensions with each passing month. I had begun dating cautiously, dinner conversations with women who seemed interesting without the pressure of seeking anything serious. It felt strange to be single in my mid-40s, navigating a landscape of romance that had changed dramatically since my courtship of Vivian 20 years earlier. In October, I received unexpected news. Dolores Fairbanks had filed for bankruptcy. The financial house of cards she had built over decades had finally collapsed under its own weight, and she was facing the consequences that had been deferred for so long. The Florida condo would be sold, the assets liquidated, the debts discharged through the impersonal machinery of federal court. Vivian called me directly for the first time since our divorce was finalized, her voice carrying a weariness I hadn't heard before. "I'm not calling to argue," she said. "I just thought you should know about my mother." "I heard. How are you handling it?" "Honestly, it's almost a relief. The pretending is finally over. She's going to move in with Gregory, if you can believe it. Miranda is not pleased." I couldn't help but laugh at the image this conjured. Dolores Fairbanks, stripped of her designer lifestyle, sharing a house with her son and his long-suffering wife. That should be interesting. To put it mildly, a pause. "Marcus, I want to apologize for a lot of things, but particularly for the way I handled my mother's situation. You were right that it wasn't fair to demand what I demanded. I just couldn't see it at the time. Thank you for saying that. It couldn't have been easy. Easier than living with the knowledge that I was wrong and never acknowledging it." Another pause. "Are you happy there? In Charleston?" "I am. It's different than I expected. Quieter, slower, but good. The work is satisfying. I've made friends. I'm finding my footing. I'm glad. The kids seem to enjoy their visits. They talk about you constantly when they come home. The things you did, the places you took them. I think they're actually closer to you now than they were when you lived here." "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's observation. Whatever else happened between us, Marcus, you're a good father." I never doubted that. The conversation ended with the cautious civility of former spouses who have moved beyond anger, but not quite to friendship. It was progress, I supposed, a thawing of hostilities that benefited everyone, especially Jake and Lily. 2 years after my disappearance from Westchester, I stood on a construction site, watching workers lay the foundation for a building I had designed. It was a modest project by my former standards, a community center for a neighborhood that had been underserved for generations, but it felt more meaningful than anything I had created in New York. The design incorporated local materials and building techniques, creating a structure that would serve multiple purposes: gathering space, after-school programs, job training facilities. The client was a non-profit organization that had struggled for years to raise the necessary funds, finally achieving their goal through a combination of grants and community fundraising. My fee was nominal, a fraction of what I would have charged for commercial work, but the satisfaction was proportionally greater. Nathan stood beside me, sharing the moment as he had shared many moments over the past 2 years. "You know, when you first arrived, I wasn't sure if you'd stay," he said. "You had this look about you, desperate maybe, or just lost. I figured you'd stick around for 6 months, get your bearings, then head back to New York and the big leagues. What changed your assessment? Watching you work, seeing how you approached projects here, not like assignments to be completed, but like puzzles to be solved, problems worth caring about. That's not something you learn or fake. It's either in you or it's not." The workers continued their steady progress, concrete being poured and shaped according to specifications I had spent months refining. In a year, families would gather in this building for celebrations and classes and the ordinary business of community life. They wouldn't know my name or care about my story, but they would benefit from work I had done with attention and intention. That evening I called Colleen to share the milestone. My sister had become my closest confidant over the past 2 years, someone who understood both where I had come from and where I was trying to go. "Congratulations," she said with genuine warmth. "You sound different than you did when all this started. Lighter, maybe. I feel lighter. Not every day, but most days. The weight I was carrying, I didn't realize how heavy it was until I set it down. Do you ever miss it? The old life, I mean. Parts of it. The daily access to Jake and Lily, the professional prestige, the financial security that came with my old position." I paused, considering. But those things came with costs I didn't fully understand at the time. The cost of constant accommodation, the cost of suppressing my own needs to maintain harmony, the cost of slowly disappearing into roles that left no room for the person underneath. Heavy costs. Too heavy. I know the way I left was dramatic and probably unfair, but I'm not sure I could have left any other way. Vivian had too much practice at manipulation, and I had too much practice at being manipulated. The clean break was the only kind that would actually hold. Jake was now 17, preparing for his senior year of high school and the college application process that consumed so much attention. He had developed into a thoughtful young man with genuine artistic talent. His guitar playing had progressed from hobbyist to serious, and he was considering music programs alongside more traditional academic options. Our relationship had matured into something approaching adult friendship, characterized by honest conversations and mutual respect. Lily, at 15, was navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence with her mother's social grace and, I like to think, her father's underlying groundedness. She visited Charleston regularly, often bringing friends who were charmed by the city's historic appeal and my indulgent approach to hosting. Vivian and I had achieved a functional co-parenting relationship, communicating regularly about the children's needs and coordinating schedules without the hostility that characterized many divorced couples. She had married Jeffrey Blackwood the previous spring, a ceremony I learned about from Jake, rather than from any direct communication, and seemed to have found contentment in her new arrangement. I had not remarried, nor had I found the kind of partnership I had once hoped my first marriage would be, but I had found something else, a sense of self that didn't depend on external validation, a daily existence that felt authentic rather than performed. These were achievements I hadn't known to aspire to before my old life ended. The foundation I watched being poured was, in some metaphorical sense, my own. After years of building on ground that had always been unstable, I was finally constructing something solid, something that could support the weight of a life actually lived rather than merely endured. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in late autumn, interrupting a design consultation with such urgency that I excused myself from the meeting immediately. It was Jake, his voice carrying a tension I had never heard before. "Dad, you need to come to New York, it's Lily. There's been an accident." The next several hours existed outside of normal time. I booked the first available flight, called Nathan to explain my indefinite absence, packed a bag with hands that couldn't quite stop trembling. On the plane, I forced myself to breathe slowly, to resist the catastrophic thinking that pressed against my consciousness like floodwater against a dam. Jake had provided the essential information during our call. Lily had been in a car accident, a collision at an intersection with a driver who ran a red light. She was alive but critically injured, undergoing surgery at a hospital in White Plains. Beyond that, details were scarce. I landed at LaGuardia and took a taxi directly to the hospital, bypassing the childhood home I hadn't seen in over 2 years. The building was a maze of corridors and waiting rooms, eventually leading me to a surgical wing, where Vivian and Jake sat in the particular posture of people waiting for news they fear might be terrible. Vivian looked older than I remembered, the intervening years having etched lines into her face that hadn't been there when we were married. Jake rose immediately and embraced me, his teenage reserve dissolved by crisis. "They're still operating," he said. "They won't tell us anything." I sat beside my former wife, our shared anxiety creating a temporary truce that superseded any remaining animosity. Jeffrey was notably absent, perhaps working, perhaps deliberately giving the family space, but I didn't ask. "Tell me what happened," I said. Vivian's voice was steady but strained. She was coming home from a friend's house, just a routine drive, nothing special. A man in a pickup truck came through the intersection without stopping, hit her on the driver's side. The driver's side. My voice sounded distant, clinical. I was processing information without allowing myself to feel it. She was conscious when the paramedics arrived. That's supposed to be a good sign. We waited. Hours passed in the particular way that hospital hours pass, slowly yet somehow, without clear demarcation, time becoming elastic in the face of uncertainty. Medical personnel came and went, offering updates that were simultaneously reassuring and vague. The surgery was proceeding. Complications were being addressed. Outcomes remained uncertain. Around midnight, a surgeon emerged from the operating room with the exhausted look of someone who had been fighting a long battle. We stood as one, our previous conflicts irrelevant in the face of this shared terror. "She's stable," the surgeon said. "There was significant trauma to the spleen and left kidney, which we were able to address. Her left leg has multiple fractures that will require additional surgery once she's stronger. She also has a concussion and some internal bleeding that we've managed to control." "But she's going to be okay?" Jake asked, voicing the question we were all afraid to ask. "She's young and strong, which works in her favor. The next 48 hours are critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic. She'll need extensive rehabilitation, but I expect a full recovery over time." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming, buckling my knees and forcing me to grip Jake's shoulder for support. Vivian was crying openly, and without thinking, I put my arm around her. A gesture of comfort that had once been automatic and now felt strange but necessary. We were allowed to see Lily briefly before she was moved to intensive care. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed, her left leg elevated and encased in hardware. But she was breathing. She was alive. "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, touching her hand gently. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until you're better." Whether she heard me, I couldn't know, but saying the words felt important, a commitment I intended to keep regardless of the cost. The following days existed in a blur of medical consultations, waiting room vigils, and the gradual accumulation of hope as Lily's condition improved. I slept at the hospital when I could, in chairs or on waiting room couches, rarely leaving the building for more than brief intervals. Jake stayed with his mother at the house, the same house I had walked away from 2 years earlier, but spent most of his waking hours at the hospital as well. We traded shifts at Lily's bedside, maintaining a constant presence so she would never wake to find herself alone. During these long hours, conversations emerged that hadn't been possible before. Vivian and I talked about our marriage, our divorce, the choices we had each made, and the consequences that had followed. Without the need to defend positions or win arguments, we were able to acknowledge truths that had been too threatening to voice when we were still antagonists. "I knew about the money," Vivian admitted during one late-night exchange. "The transfers to my mother, I mean. I knew they were wrong, but I told myself they were necessary. That the alternative Letting her face the consequences of her own choices was too cruel to contemplate. You were protecting her the way you always protected her. It was a pattern, not a choice. That's generous of you. It's not generosity, it's understanding. I've had time to think about all of this, Vivian, to see our marriage as something more than a simple story of victim and villain. We were both products of our circumstances, both doing what we thought we had to do. Even the affair, she said it quietly, perhaps expecting me to react with anger or bitterness. Even that, I'm not saying it was acceptable, but I understand it. You were unhappy, and you didn't know how to address that unhappiness within the confines of our marriage. You found something outside that you couldn't find inside. It's a depressingly common story. You never confronted me about it. Before you left, I mean. What would have been the point? By the time I discovered it, I had already decided to leave. The affair was additional evidence, not the primary cause. These conversations didn't heal the wounds of our failed marriage. That kind of healing takes years if it happens at all, but they softened the edges of our mutual disappointment. We had both made mistakes. We had both caused harm. We were both, in different ways, trying to move forward. Lily's recovery was slow but steady. The second surgery on her leg went well, and physical therapy began as soon as she was strong enough to participate. She faced the long process of rehabilitation with a determination that made me intensely proud, refusing to succumb to the frustration and despair that would have been understandable under the circumstances. I stayed in New York for 6 weeks, far longer than I had anticipated. Nathan assured me that my projects were being handled, that I should take whatever time I needed, that my place at the firm would be waiting when I was ready to return. It was the kind of professional support I had never experienced in my former career, and I was grateful for it. During these weeks, I reconnected with aspects of my old life that I had deliberately abandoned. I visited my former office at Brennan & Associates, where colleagues greeted me with genuine warmth despite my extended absence. I walked through the streets of Manhattan, seeing the city with eyes that had been transformed by 2 years in a very different environment. I even had dinner with Theodore Yates, my attorney from the divorce proceedings, who had become something like a friend in the aftermath. "You look good," Theodore observed over steaks at a restaurant we had frequented during darker times. "Healthy? I'm not sure I ever saw you look this relaxed when you lived here." Charleston agrees with me. The pace, the climate, the general approach to life, it suits me better than I expected. And yet here you are, back in New York for 6 weeks. Maybe the old life still has some hold on you. I considered the observation. The hold is my children. That never changed, and it never will. But the life itself, the career I built, the marriage I maintained, the identity I performed, I don't miss that. I miss what I thought it was, before I understood what it actually was. That's remarkably philosophical for an architect. I've had time to think. 2 years of building a new life from scratch provides plenty of opportunity for reflection. On the day before my scheduled return to Charleston, I visited the Westchester house for the first time since my departure. Vivian had invited me for dinner with Jake and Lily, a family gathering of sorts, though the definition of family had expanded to include Jeffrey, who had gradually become part of the household routine. The house looked different than I remembered, which made sense given the time that had passed and the changes in its inhabitants. Vivian had redecorated in ways that erased my presence. New furniture, different artwork, colors I wouldn't have chosen. But it remained recognizable, a container for memories that would always be part of my history. Lily was recovering well enough to join us at the dinner table, her injured leg elevated on a cushion but her spirits high. Jake sat beside her, the protective older brother he had always been, but with new intensity given recent events. Jeffrey, to his credit, made himself useful without attempting to insert himself into family dynamics that predated his arrival. The meal was pleasant in ways I hadn't anticipated. We discussed Lily's rehabilitation, Jake's college plans, Vivian's work with her charitable boards. We talked about Charleston, about my projects there, about the community center that had recently been completed. We existed together, as people who shared a past and a mutual investment in certain children's futures, without the conflict that had characterized our final years as a married couple. After dinner, I found a moment alone with Jake on the back porch, looking out at the yard where he had once played as a child. "Thanks for calling me when it happened," I said. "I know it could have waited until there was more information, but I'm glad I was there for those early hours. You're her father, of course you should have been there. That's not always how these things work. Divorced parents sometimes get cut out of emergencies, especially when the relationships are difficult." "Our relationship isn't difficult anymore." Jake said it as a simple statement of fact, without sentimentality. "It was, for a while. But I think we've figured it out. You, me, Lily, even Mum. We're different from how we were, but we're still family. That matters. It matters more than anything." The next morning, I took an early flight back to Charleston. My apartment was waiting, my work was waiting, my life was waiting. The life I had built from the ruins of my first attempt at happiness. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was mine, honestly constructed and authentically inhabited. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The marriage that had looked successful from the outside while rotting from within. The discovery that had shattered my illusions. The demand that had pushed me past my breaking point. The disappearance that had seemed dramatic at the time but had proved necessary for survival. And then the reconstruction. The new city, the new career, the new relationships. The preservation of what mattered, my children, my self-respect, my capacity for genuine connection, while releasing what had become toxic. The gradual realization that escaping wasn't the same as running away, that choosing yourself wasn't the same as abandoning others. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 45 years old, a partner at an architectural firm in Charleston, father of 2 remarkable young people, former husband, ongoing work in progress. I disappeared once from a life that was killing me slowly, and I found my way to something better. Not perfect, but better. Not finished, but continuing. The story never really ends, I've learned. It just keeps developing new chapters, each one building on what came before, each one reaching towards something undefined, but worth pursuing. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.